And this leads me to this next topic that I wanted you to touch on, which entails that symptoms and the concussion are not correlated in a one-to-one ratio, meaning once the symptoms have dissipated, that doesn't mean that you're ready to return to sport necessarily, because you're still potentially at that energy deficit. And I know in that chart that you described, even though they're starting to feel better, just like other injuries too. I mean, I don't see actually I don't see any concussions in my practice, but with like post-op ACL reconstruction or maybe even a rotator cuff strain, people feel better, and therefore they feel like they should get back to these higher level activities. However, in reality, they can do a lot more harm than good at that point. So if you can explain to the audience a little more about why that's the case and why you shouldn't necessarily just jump back to sport if you feel like you're ready for it, to give people a little bit of a better understanding about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all the same concepts that you mentioned with other injuries, right? We typically have functional benchmarks for people to return back to sport, right? Whether it be ankle sprains, ACLs, various shoulder injuries and whatever else. We have kind of functional tests that we put people through before we allow them to go into kind of a dangerous sport, right? With concussion, however, even if you read the international consensus guidelines, these decisions tend to be made on a symptom-based approach, right? So as soon as your symptoms go away, you're supposed to do these various activities, but the problem is no one's actually doing them, right? According to the Berlin Consensus Statement, it's you rest until you're asymptomatic, or you have mild rest or moderate below symptom threshold rest, meaning you can do anything that doesn't aggravate your symptoms. Then you're getting into moderate, physical activity. Then you're getting into non-contact practices, and then you're getting into increased intensity practices with still no contact, and other types of training drills such as weightlifting and whatever else. And then you get into full contact practice following your medical clearance state, and then you're in now to full, recovery. The problem is that those stages, there's 6 of them. They're supposed to be separated by 24 hours, and people will just generally look at that as a 6-day, while I'd be gone, I'm out for a week. But
Right.
they don't actually, like most physicians, aren't putting people on treadmills and actually running them through the functional tests and actually checking out how they do at 2 practices non-contact, and actually seeing, any functional tests. Are we measuring people's balance, reaction time, memory, concentration, vision, neurocognitive function, all these things? Are these actually being done before we're making a decision to return an athlete back to sport? In the wide majority of cases, no, that's not happening. I think it's better in the States because people they're doing baselines and they're doing post-injury tests, but for the majority, they're only doing computerized neurocognitive testing, which by itself actually has some issues with retest reliability. And so that's one tool, and I think that's a great start, but most people aren't aware that tool has reliability that with other measures like balance, like postural sway, like reaction time, like ocular motor function, saccadic visual tests, and things like that can offset any retest reliability. So you really want a comprehensive battery of protocols to be in place, but you have to do them. You can't just write them on a piece of paper and expect that they're being done, because right now, the vast majority of cases, it's, doctor says, how do you feel? Well, I feel fine now. I feel better. Okay, well then go ahead, go back to your sport, and not realizing the implications of that. Because as you mentioned, there's this energy drop. And the evidence, at least from an animal standpoint, shows that if those animals get back up to where their full energy levels are and they do suffer another concussion, they just go through that same process again. So in other words, it's just another concussion. But if they hit these animals in the middle of their recovery when they're still not back up to full energy levels, well, then they actually they get much, much, much worse, and they end up with injuries that are similar to severe brain injuries. And actually 10% of them will actually die as a result of that secondary injury. And this is called second impact syndrome. And this has happened in humans in playing high school sports across the US and a few times in Canada as well, where player gets injured with a concussion, goes back too soon, and has a fatal outcome from a subsequent hit. So the whole thing about concussion is ensuring that we're getting them back to full recovery. But like you said, the symptoms tend to go away way before the physiologic recovery actually occurs. And so what we're trying to do with all the stuff that we're doing is take an evidence-based approach and say, okay, you feel good now? That's great. Let's put you on the treadmill. Let's ramp up your heart rate, see where you're at. Okay, now they have an increase in symptoms with that. Well, obviously they weren't ready, but then we can run them through a proper protocol to get them there. And then, okay, you've passed that. Now you're going back to practice. Now you're doing this. Now at the final step, we're doing another physical exertion testing. And then we're running through a full battery of physical and cognitive tests to try and make sure that we've gotten them to a point where it's actually safe for them to return to sport. The problem is it's not being done, as nearly as often as what it should be. And kind of that's another, mandate of what our process is try and make sure that people are safe before we send them back into sports.
Yeah, talk about risk versus reward with that. It seems to be that most injuries are kind of like that, where, for example, you have an ankle sprain. That's the highest predictor of another ankle sprain. You have a hamstring strain, same idea. And you have to be careful with how you rehab that, because how you rehab that is preventing future injuries of that same exact mechanism. And the future injury, like you said, which is 10% of animals died after that secondary concussion. So there's a huge risk there, and you got to be very careful in how you rehabilitate after